We're going to talk about our last two nutrients. One is a macronutrient, the other one's a micronutrient combination, so proteins, vitamins, and minerals. So a protein is what we call a polypeptide. So these are polymers, just a poly there suggests that, built from amino acid monomers. Amino acids look like this. This is a molecule of a generic amino acid. It has a carbon, and then it has this NH2 group on this one side, which is called the amino group, and then it has the COOH group, which is called the carboxyl group. These two are important because they're the parts that will connect with other amino acids to form this polypeptide or protein. But the unique properties of the polypeptide that you form depends on what R group is attached to that amino acid. So R group is just a generic symbol we use for some type of a carbon chain. And there's different types. We actually have 20 amino acids that humans need, and that's where we make all our proteins from, is some combination of those 20 amino acids. And the length of that polymer could be hundreds to thousands to longer chain of amino acids. But of those 20, there are 9 essential ones that we have to take in from outside source. We can't make them in our own body, and these are listed here. For example, tryptophan probably is one that you recognize. If you eat too much turkey during Thanksgiving, contains a lot of tryptophan, makes you sleepy. But this whole side chain right here, this whole structure right here, a little hard to see, but there's a ring and there's some longer groups here. That all goes into this R, so it's substituted into this R right here, okay? These different side chains result in different properties of the protein that you eat. Because other macronutrients that we talk about, fat and carbohydrates, don't have nitrogen, but protein does because it has this amino group in it, and some of the side chains also have a nitrogen in them. It's the principal source of nitrogen for our body. So if we need any nitrogen containing molecule in our cells, that has to come from proteins. Proteins that you eat is always broken down into simpler pieces, eventually into the amino acids, and even simpler. And then you're gonna take those pieces and remake them into something else. Proteins are found in meat type of products like beef, fish, and poultry. They all have these essential amino acids, and so you have to eat them in order to maintain a complete set of proteins in your body. Going from proteins to vitamins and minerals, these two are what we call micronutrients. We don't need them for energy sources, but we need them for specific functioning of the cells. So there are certain proteins in your cell that require iron to function. If iron, which is a mineral, is not present, then that protein will not work. If that protein doesn't work, then you're going to have problems. But we don't need a lot of them, we just need them in small amounts, okay? The problem is a lot of the processed foods that are sold in grocery stores, they're high in sugars and fats, but they don't really have much of the micronutrients. So as a result, if that's what you eat every day, then you have to supplement it with some kind of multivitamins or some kind of mineral supplements. So vitamins, generally we classify them based on their ability to be either water or fat soluble. The way you tell whether a vitamin is water or fat soluble is just by looking at their molecular polarity, a concept we discussed in a prior chapter. The simpler way to determine polarity in vitamin, because they're such large molecules, is to look at how many polar groups they have versus non-polar groups. So this table here shows you what we consider to be polar groups versus non-polar groups. So anytime you have a hydroxyl group, which is the OH group, the carbonyl group, which is the CO group, the carboxyl group, which is the COOH group, and then the amino group, which is the NH2 group. So these four right here are considered the more polar version of molecular groups that are present in vitamins. And then we also have just carbon-carbon chain, which is just methyl in this case. So if you have a lot of these CH3 groups or CC groups, then they are non-polar. We had discussed this before in terms of analyzing polarity of bonds. So this is just putting them in the context of these vitamins. If you see a lot of polar groups in the structure, so for example, here I'm showing you two different types of vitamin B. So vitamin B is a complex of vitamins that has a lot of members in them. These are just two of them. Vitamin B5, which is called pantothenic acid, and then vitamin B3, which is called nicotinic acid. You can see that there's combination of polar and nonpolar groups. So the black part here is the nonpolar portion, and then the blue parts are the polar portion. There's enough of the polar portion to make this a water-soluble vitamin. Same thing with this one right here. Now here though, on the other hand, is vitamin K, where there's only a couple of polar groups, which is the blue ones. The rest of them is just those carbon chains. And you might recall that I had mentioned that these zigzag lines, if there's nothing attached to them, these are just carbon and hydrogen. So vitamin K would be considered fat soluble because it's very nonpolar, and fat is a nonpolar molecule. To go back to the structure of fat earlier, you can see that it has a long chain of carbon-carbon, which is all nonpolar. So that's why fat is considered a nonpolar molecule. The last part here is just to mention some minerals that are important for us. So even with minerals, we divide them into three types: macro, micro, and trace. Macro is the one that we need in large quantity, but not so much as the major atoms like oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, which we can get from those macronutrients, right? The carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fats. These are much smaller compared to those, but we still need quite a bit of them. So sodium, magnesium, potassium, and so on. Calcium for bones. Microminerals we need in smaller quantities, but still important. That I mentioned earlier, iron is needed because one of the proteins in the red blood cells, hemoglobin, requires iron to function, to bind to oxygen. Function of that protein is to then take the oxygen, transport it to another cell that requires oxygen to generate energy. So if you don't have the iron, it limits the ability of the hemoglobin to carry oxygen, and therefore if your cells lack oxygen, then it's going to not be able to generate enough energy for you to do your activities. Trace minerals are the ones you need in very small quantities. Again, these are usually what we call cofactors for certain enzymes in the cell. The enzymes are things that help the chemical reactions in the cell to progress. They're catalysts. If you don't have these trace minerals, then the enzymes won't work. A major reason why we eat food is to get energy that comes from the chemical bonds in the substances that are found in different types of food. And the major nutrients that we take in, which are fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, are all sources of energy. All of this energy initially arrives on Earth in the form of sunlight. However, we then convert that sunlight energy into different types of macronutrients. The main one that happens in green plants is the production of glucose, or the simple sugar, in the process of photosynthesis, where carbon dioxide and water, with the help of sunlight, is being used to make glucose, which has the formula C6H12O6, and oxygen gas. Now I want you to go ahead and try to balance that reaction to see what the coefficients are for all of the species. The sugar that's produced by plants is then consumed by humans or animals. In the cells that make up our bodies, they are broken down in the process called cellular respiration. And this is just the reverse of the photosynthesis reaction. So then you get this equation right here. You can see now the sugar is reacted with oxygen gas, which we inhale, to produce water and carbon dioxide, which we exhale. The amount of energy we get is typically provided in per gram of each of the macronutrient. And so we can see here that fat produces 9 calories per gram. It's referring to that nutritional calorie. 9 nutritional calories per gram for fat. Carbohydrate and protein both provide 4 calories per gram. So here's an example. If you have a mac and cheese box that has 4 servings with 9 grams of total fat, how much energy do you get if you eat 2 servings of this mac and cheese? Well, first off, there's 9 grams of total fat. That's out of 4 servings. You eat 2 servings of it, so that would allow you to calculate how many grams of fat you actually eat. Each gram provides 9 calories, so you multiply that by that conversion factor and you get 40.5 calories. Again, this is your nutritional calories. Where does all the energy goes to? One of the major things that we need to provide energy for is something called the basal metabolic rate, or BMR. This is just to make sure that everything is working. Your brain can work, your lungs pumping air, your heart is beating to pump blood, all your major organs, kidney, pancreas, everything is working, and your body temperature is maintained at about 37 degrees. Just to get all of these things to be running, you need about 1 calorie per kilogram of body mass per hour. This number could change, but generally speaking, it's a reasonable number to use to estimate how much calories needed by a person. So for example, here we have a 20-year-old female weighing 55 kilograms, which is about 120 pounds. And if you have that minimum requirement of 1 calorie per gram per hour, what's her daily BMR? Well, you can calculate it. This is the requirement, which is 1 calorie per kilogram per hour. There's 24 hours in a day, and her body weight is 55 kilograms. So when you multiply across, you get 1,300 calories per day. Now, you might have heard the number 2,000 calories per day. That includes keeping up the BMR plus some other activities that you do. So if you walk, run, other activities, they all generate more energy than just the BMR. The BMR is if you're doing absolutely nothing. So what I want you to do is go back and look at your own weight in kilograms, do that conversion, and figure out what is your BMR requirement for yourself.